you have. I'll start with an introduction. My name is Melanie LeBert. I'm the manager at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children at Western University. On behalf of neighbors, families, and friends, welcome to the webinar today called Reframing Inaccessibility as Structural Violence in the Lives of Mothers with Disabilities. Please think about the traditional lands you are currently situated on and join us in acknowledging and thanking the generations of Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands and in celebrating the continued strength and spirit of Indigenous peoples. The ongoing work to make the promise of truth and reconciliation real in our communities, and in particular, to bring justice for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls across the country, should inform our discussions in this webinar today and beyond. Today's presentation will be 1 hour long with 15 minutes at the end for questions. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom to type in your questions. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Neighbors, Friends, and Families website and shared via email in a few days. I'm now happy to introduce our speaker, who is a friend of the center and fellow researcher here at Western University. Melanie Stone is currently the Accessibility Specialist for the City of London and a PhD candidate in the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at Western University. Her doctoral work examines the work experiences of mothers with disabilities in London, Ontario, using Photovoice. She's also on the board of directors of Women's Para Hockey of Canada and an adjunct professor in disability studies and sociology programs at King's University College. Welcome, Melanie.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to neighbors, families, and friends for having me here today. I'm really excited to share the findings of a about 2-year-long, 18 months to 2-year-long study that I did here in London, Ontario, with amazing women and local advocates who gave me their time and access to their stories and shared so much with me so that I could help share those things with you. So the webinar is entitled Reframing Inaccessibility as Structural Violence in the Lives of Mothers with Disabilities. And off the top, I want to say I speak with sort of two important roles. One is that I'm currently an accessibility specialist, so I operate within systems and for systems that can be accessible and can also be very inaccessible. And also I research those systems as a PhD candidate. So at the end of this webinar, I'm going to kind of try and bring things together a little bit and talk about how I reconcile those two identities. I will tell you that I'm going to start with a difficult story. I am going to be sharing a story that contains a death of a woman as a result of structural violence. And I'm going to indicate both visually and verbally the start of that story in case there's anyone who may want to mute or step away during that story. I will signal the end of that story, again, both verbally and visually, and then begin the webinar. It's important that I indicate that throughout this webinar, I am sharing women's stories and women's experiences with structural violence, but none of the photos are graphic in nature or very difficult to see. They just demonstrate difficult experiences. It's important to know where to get help if you're in immediate danger. Please call 911, and the Assaulted Women's Helpline hosts a crisis line that's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every day of the year. And this is that contact information, and it will be shared in the chat throughout the presentation. So I just want to do a brief overview. I'm going to talk a little bit about Photovoice, which is the methodology that I used for this project and how it can help us better frame structural inequality. I'm going to actually let the women in the study speak for themselves and share their own photos. So I'll be sharing their voices and stories that were shared with me. I'm going to sort of frame a few solutions and possibilities that were suggested. As we've moved through COVID, we've suddenly been able to see how quickly barriers can come down. And so some of those suggestions have been rightfully made by the participants in the study. And then I'm just going to do a quick reflection on policy, community building, and meaningful change and what it means when you're in this role as an accessibility specialist, or how to make the space that you occupy more accessible. All right, so I'm going to begin with a difficult story. It's going to last approximately 2 minutes. And at the end of the difficult story, I will signal that I'm done with a slide with a little flower on it that indicates the end of the difficulty. And I'm going to begin that story now. In August 2002, Kimberly Rogers died in her Sudbury apartment in the middle of an August heat wave while serving time on house arrest for welfare fraud. She was 8 months pregnant at the time. Rogers had been sentenced to 6 months of house arrest for the crime of obtaining an Ontario student loan while also receiving benefits from the Ontario Disability Support Program, ODSP. Student loans were designated as income under the Ontario Works Act and were made illegal to obtain at the same time as disability supports. Obtaining student loans and ODSP together had not been illegal when Rogers had started her schooling, but was made illegal during her schooling time. And the Harris Conservative government had restructured support policies to make withdrawing OSAP and ODSP a form of welfare fraud. As she wrapped up her studies, the OSAP income was reported, and Rogers stood trial and was found guilty. The punishment for her crime was a lifetime ban on welfare, the Ontario Works Drug Benefit Program and housing assistance. Rogers had relied on all of these supports. Kimberly Rogers came to represent a casualty in a renewed war on the poor, encouraged by a provincial government which worked hard to paint poverty as a personal failure, and those living with social assistance as leeches who threatened the public good. As a pregnant woman with a disability, Rogers had been sentenced to a lifetime suspension of benefits, which included the drug benefits she required for treatment of addiction and depression. At the time of her death, her apartment, where she was forced to serve her 6-month house arrest, was not air conditioned, causing speculation that the heat had caused her death. But the coroner's report ruled her death by suicide, likely the cause of an overdose in prescription medication. 6 months worth of this medication was dispensed to her in advance, so she would never have to leave her home for a prescription renewal during her house arrest. Rogers' death led to an intensive inquest into welfare restrictions and punishment for welfare fraud. It also highlighted the impact of new welfare regulations on women with disabilities and mothers with disabilities. The story has now concluded. I will no longer be mentioning the death going forward. But as a result of this terrible incident, changes were made to the benefits program, and they were hard-fought changes by many community advocates. New rules allowed ODSP recipients to obtain student loans and minor funds from part-time employment. It removed a lifetime ban on welfare as punishment. Ontario Works drug benefits, serious illnesses or disability. And nearly 20 years later, the Ontario Works Act no longer prevents individuals with disabilities from obtaining student loans with their benefits, but increasing surveillance and reporting structures in place as a result of austerity measures have still proven detrimental and life-limiting. And while we did have the old government replaced with a Liberal government, we have once again returned to a populist Conservative leader who has brought new intensive focuses on stories like those of Kimberly Rogers, who we must never forget. Today, Ontario Works recipients, ODSP recipients, and students remain a steady part of a broader populist message of punishing the poor and advancing austerity. Basic income pilots have been canceled despite increasing evidence of their positive impact in the lives of those who relied on the benefits. And there's even been suggestion that we're going to redefine disability so that we can get people back to work. It's important to not minimize the impact of this story on my own research. I was a very young caseworker when this happened. I was very new to accessibility advocacy, and it was almost 20 years ago. I've been doing it for that long. And it really shaped the way I understood how mothers with disabilities in particularly were at the margins of ableism and sort of an increasing surveillance on mothers, increasing pressure on mothers in general. So I began my PhD using Photovoice, and there were actually 6 women involved in this study. It was a very intense, long study, and all of the women were given cameras, sort of advanced point and shoot cameras, and they were asked to take pictures of anything that they felt represented barriers that they faced. You know, I talked about, we don't just want to talk about negative things, we want to talk about creativity, fun stuff, anything you want to talk about together. And then what happened is each of the women participated in a narrative interview where they led the discussion. We had 4 focus group Photovoice research opportunities. So they all came together to talk about the photos that they took, found common elements, found common ideas for change, really came together to build amazing insight into their lives, both as a group and then again as individuals. And at the end of the study of all of those Photovoice meetings, we actually met one-on-one for a final semi-structured qualitative interview that was based on, you know, each woman had sort of a different interview based on the things that she'd brought up personally. So we looked at women as a group and then also as individuals with different needs, different wants, different wishes. And Photovoice is a participatory action research methodology defined by Carolyn Wang and Marianne Burris as a group process where participants use photography to capture reflections of their experiences, and where the group participates in a process of reflection on these images and the stories that their photos represent in order to find common themes, shared experiences, and opportunities for change. The focus of this work is ultimately to understand how work has become increasingly difficult for mothers with disabilities, and to understand the many obstacles to paid employment revealed by mothers with disabilities, because they must navigate the extraordinary and ordinary ableism in their communities to provide for themselves and their children. Inaccessible transit systems, lack of accessible childcare, lack of accessible play groups, mothers groups, opinions of hospital staff and doctors. It was an extraordinary number of overlapping obstacles. And towards the end of this presentation, I'll talk about why I no longer use the word barrier to talk about them. Businesses were inaccessible, education was difficult to navigate, regular bureaucracy took up significant time, benefits were inadequate, even housing, laundry, food preparation was often inaccessible to women in their own homes. So I'm going to take us first to the very first photo in this series, because I think it does a really good job of bringing us into a moment together. So in this photo, Evelyn, one of the mothers in the study, does two things. She takes a photo at the edge of her purple wheelchair, and this is an image of wood chips and then a cement edge, and then just the edge of a small wheel on a wheelchair that is purple on the side of a leg, pitched at the edge of a park. The gray concrete, a high edge, unsurpassable in a wheelchair, creates a wall between herself and the park where her child is at play. And we move to the second photo, and we see her young child. And as a parent, these photos make my heart stop. The inability to get to your child in a moment of need, to engage with them at play, is difficult. It can also be dangerous. In this picture, we're faced with the difficult moments that Evelyn experiences every day as a mother with a disability, and we navigate these two photos to locate ourselves in her position. The other is an emotional photo where we can see the effects of the barrier imposed by the concrete edge and a soft bed of wood chips in which the wheelchair would be easily upturned, wheels sinking into the wet chips and rendering this whole experience rather dangerous. Evelyn eventually sought out daycare supports for her child, in part because there were so few places where he could safely play with other children. She said, "I go to a park and I can't push him on the swings. I can't follow him if he climbs too high. I am just tired of saying mommy can't. He needs kids and he needs to play, but there are too many places that I don't fit and I can't go, so he has to go to daycare to get that." She also says, he knows. He will look for the blue sign, the accessible sign, and he's upset in this photo. And this park is labeled as accessible, but I can't get to the swings. So my only issue is that it's hard, you know? I hear moms saying, "I've gone out and done this with my kid, and I've gone out and done that with my kid." And I'm like, "Oh, I can't get into the park around the corner from my house. And that's down the street. Just can't use it." Evelyn has internalized the park's inaccessibility. So her language shifts from "the park is inaccessible" to "I can't." The park is inaccessible, so she can't. Evelyn faced a significant number of hardships throughout our time together, and she's an incredible community advocate and very vocal and wonderful in our community. But this was an incident she shares with us because she stresses how difficult it is to do the day-to-day activities of parenting. Evelyn's son also attends daycare because the types of work that she needs to engage in just to get groceries, pick up a prescription, run errands, all take an extraordinary amount of time and planning. And as Evelyn says, you know, there are not enough spaces for me. In the next photo, we see what happens when she attempts to make space to run for an errand. And this is that photo. So I had just gone to the dealership and had just had the van run through the car wash. I had to get ice cream. So I went to the superstore and there was no handicap parking space left. I parked over 2 spaces closer to the store. I would usually park in the middle of nowhere land. I just have to get ice cream. I'm not going for 20 minutes. I came out and someone had smeared toothpaste down both sides of my van. Lots of swears, lots of crying. That's the one day I'd taken his backpack out of the car, so I didn't even have baby wipes. So I was trying to get this stuff off with Kleenex, and another mother stopped, and this was in the hot sun, and it's starting to melt, and it's starting to run, and this mother says they didn't. Well, they either had it in the purse or they had to dig through their groceries to do this. Evelyn's van is very well marked with accessibility labels up and down. So it was very clear that this is why she needed to park the way that she did. But we can look here into these moments of enabled entitlement and enabled people's entitlement. And we see a common occurrence of harassment and confrontation in this vandalism as enabled people try to challenge people with disabilities for taking up their space. These confrontations are exceptionally common and everyday. And in fact, one of the challenges that some of the women faced actually involved bringing their camera into these confrontations. So we had to work on metaphors and other ways for them to engage so that they weren't put at risk. We had to have those conversations together. And in this case, it could have been far worse if the person had still been around. But we look and we see that Evelyn understands that there are just so few opportunities for her to fit in the community. And when she tries to fit herself in the community, there's a backlash. A simple errand to get ice cream resulted in a really painful and distressing experience. And this is an everyday worry. This next photo shows a drawing by one of the young participants' young children. The images were shared by Alex, a mother in the study. Her young daughter drew the life story of a mother. On one side, we see fired, another kid, evicted, sued, crash, lose scholarship, lost pet. On the other is husband, job, moving, free insurance, raise, help. It's an extraordinary commentary on how the child sees her mother's life and how binary the good and the bad. This blue pen drawing of a mother is reaching out to the good side with a grim look on her face, clutching a baby, bags under her eyes, and block letters that say life, life, life around her. This photo prompted an intense discussion about structural violence in the court system, child welfare interventions, and a fear of judgment broadly as a mother with a disability with few choices. It also demonstrates that children are watching and that they understand very clearly what their mothers are facing and that they know how it impacts them. In this time of child-friendly and baby-friendly spaces, we must stop to recognize how friendly these spaces are if the mothers of those children and babies are never welcome. How is a space baby-friendly if the baby's mother cannot get in? Alex describes mothering with a disability like walking a tightrope. She says, the image that always comes into mind, it's like walking a tightrope. You have to stay on this tightrope when everything is trying to shake you off, but you have to keep your feet like this, and the stress of just being worried about the misstep. I mean, it's like a tightrope walk that keeps you in the place where you are, just strong all the time. And people will comment on you being a perfectionist, and I'm like, I want to hurt you right now. You're allowed to make mistakes that I'm not allowed to make. Your mistakes will not impact your life and the lives of people that you love most in the same way that my mistakes will. Indeed, surveillance by state actors and interventions by child welfare organizations were ever present in our discussions. One mother in the study described her unique experience as an immigrant who was a little unfamiliar with the Canadian healthcare system. She was under the impression, because she was told so at the hospital, that it was very common for a social worker to visit a new mother every month for the first year or so of that child's life. Cora had already been raising her other 4-year-old son with the help of her husband and assistance of her mother. She had everything she needed to parent successfully and was actually a community advocate herself who, if she needed something, would help find it. It wasn't until she returned back to work after maternity leave and mentioned to the social worker to a colleague that they informed her that no, this was actually not commonplace and that they thought perhaps it was because she had a disability. Most of the mothers in the study had visits from children's aid organizations. It was common and it was distressing. Most were trying their best to make things as normal as possible for their children. Cora shared, yeah, because my disability keeps me away from bringing my kids to different activities that all the rest are doing. Sometimes I feel that I deprive them of not being able to go to sports. I don't have that for them. And I feel worried sometimes, or I feel left out and I feel bad. But I also try to talk to myself and say, it's not, maybe that's their normal, but you have a different normal. So you accept your own life, your own normal, and work it out the best you can. Evelyn also talked about her experiences with that community violence and the enabling violence that she felt, and the surveillance. And she says, I don't want my child to see this. I don't want, if I can't get my shopping done or my errands done while he's in daycare, to see toothpaste on my van. I don't want him to see that. I don't want him to see mommy having a breakdown or saying, mommy, don't cry. I don't need him in that. That's not fair to him. I've been told when he was first born, when I took him out to the mall for the first time, a woman told me I was selfish for having him. And Cora said of her surveillance, when I get back to work, I tell my colleagues and they say, no, Cora, no, that's because you have a disability. But I guess, to check, I guess they just checked on him. I just didn't need that. I mean, I guess it's okay. It's okay. In this next photo, which was taken by Charlotte, one of the mothers in the study, the image is of a large industrial workplace light surrounded by darkness. Charlotte took the photo to identify the particular challenges of structural inaccessibility in the workplace. In this case, her pain and migraines were exacerbated by lighting just like this. This prompted a conversation by the other participants about lighting, accommodations, and impact of structural inaccessibility on job performance. In the study, there was significant discussion about the bureaucracy of accommodations, the ways in which employers cause harm by changing the rules or making accommodations for one person but not for others. The downloading of responsibilities for human rights and accommodations onto the whims of different managers meant that women in the study were always navigating new and more difficult barriers. And those barriers were often people and people in power. So Charlotte says, the place that I work, it has really bad lighting, bad work hours. The way that they schedule part-time staff in particular, it's really difficult to maintain sleep hygiene, which affects everything. The more sporadic my work schedule, the more days I spend in bed with migraines, but there's no respect for that. They just tell you this is the nature of the work and well, you have to deal with it. It's the nature of the work. So yeah, pretty yucky, but practice good self-care. The same was felt in education. 3 of the women in the study had returned to school and were struggling with accommodations. In these cases, the participants were told that their accommodations were left up to individual instructors or professors and that they had to repeat their requests and disclosure of disability again and again, hoping that each professor would come through. This patchwork of unnecessary self-advocacy made schooling and work and parenting far more difficult. And when women grew weary or angry about the constant fight, they were told they needed to change their attitude and develop a more positive manner. Language of self-care was criticized by women who didn't have the luxury of that time and also just required community care and community to care. The language of resiliency as well, this idea falls flat on a group of women who fight to be included every day under shifting social arrangements and ever-changing rules. They began to internalize the lack of belonging and inclusion at work. And in one statement, Charlotte said, a lot of it is relating to the depression. I don't believe I am qualified. I don't feel like I deserve the work that I am trained to do. I don't feel like I'm capable. And the process of looking for work and interviewing is so daunting. And I think that a lot of people feel that way. And it's tied with my depression big time. I have a difficult time with the process. So once I got this job, I just said to myself, I've got myself work and I could give myself a break from that and just think about what I want to do next. But like my husband and my daughter hate my job. I don't get to be with them nearly as much as I'd like to be or that they'd like to be. Charlotte wasn't just speaking about the hours on the job away from her family, but the impact of that inaccessible workplace, lack of sleep hygiene, and effects on her mental and physical abilities. The more difficult her workspace, the more inaccessible the work practices, the less she had to share with her family, her energy, and herself. Charlotte's daughter also has a disability, and the lack of accommodation has a direct impact on how Charlotte takes care of herself and her child. About inaccessible education, Alex says, there was a lot of times they needed me that I couldn't be there. And there's something really ironic and sad sitting in the class learning about children and learning about what they needed to be happy and healthy and knowing you couldn't provide it because you were in class learning about it. It was really painful. And I would say by the end, I was pretty bitter. And people around me knew that. I wasn't good at hiding it. And I was told by my director that it was possible. My approach was what made life so hard. So this next photo may feel familiar to many of you. It certainly is to me. the difference in this photo, I think, is where June's social location is. And so while this looks familiar to many of us, it's important to note that June's apartment building is actually inaccessible. So while the laundry is on the first floor, the elevator only goes to the second. Her building did not have an elevator that went to the first floor where the laundry was. It stopped at the top of a staircase leading down to the laundry below. And June struggled with housework and juggling full-time schooling and parenting with a disability. She lived in housing that she felt was poorly maintained and which made it more difficult for her to complete housekeeping and acts of daily living. Mothers with disabilities are first given few options for housing that are accessible and then blamed when their homes aren't tidy, laundry unfinished. That's how this works. June strategized different ways of negotiating her laundry pieces at a time, sliding down the stairs on her bottom. Sometimes she'd have help, sometimes she'd have help from her daughters, but she was frustrated mostly by the people who could help her and just wouldn't. She says, I have cockroaches, I have carpet, and my carpet is disgusting. I got the building manager in to see it and said, listen, I'm just asking for bare floors. I just need the floors that you're putting in all the other units. I've lived here for 4 years and never asked you for anything, not a damn thing. I've never asked for cupboard doors or new doors or the closets, and I just keep it simple. But I asked her to take the carpets out of there, and she looked at me and she said, it's a housekeeping issue. And I told her to get out of my apartment. I used some very colorful language. How am I supposed to do the laundry? The laundry room was on the first floor, and the elevator doesn't go down there. June is not the only mother to navigate inaccessible and inaffordable housing. The options for mothers with disabilities are significantly limited and involve wait lists. Survival is about compromise and your constant battles with landlords, building managers, and politicians. And she wasn't alone. One of the mothers actively fought to be heard by every politician in the city, from city councilors to MPs to MPPs, regardless of party affiliation. Evelyn says, I've called this MPP, he never called me back. I've met that MP and she just talked around me. I talked to this MP from the other party and didn't even get into their office. They're all just bounce boards. They pass it on to offices in Ottawa. Well, I'm not in Ottawa. Mothers in the study frequently downplayed the work it took them to survive and the work they took on behalf of others living with similar challenges. They were clear, however, that most of the offer very little to live for. In a difficult quote, June shares, I didn't have anything. My kids are dependent on me. I was in an abusive relationship, I got addicted, but what happens to people who aren't accepted to university and who don't get that positive put into them? It took 3 years for me to even get to a place where I could move forward. Going back to ODSP, I can't imagine going back. Who wants to live without hope? In sharing this next image, I have to be a little bit careful. To share too much about this photo and its symbolism would share too much about who took it. It could give away the woman's identity, but this photo was taken on Mother's Day, a time when the world seemed very dark for her and her child. This beautiful and haunting photo helped the participants interrogate their experience as a mother in very meaningful ways. What was a mother? Why was mother work more difficult for those with disabilities? What did it mean if you were a mother who couldn't brush your child's hair or drive them to an appointment or hold them tight? Photovoice allows for these powerful conversations to take place, for social change to be investigated, for shared moments of laughter, of pain, of hope for change systems. And ultimately, while the project had its dark moments, it was filled with some hope. As Lynn says, I think one of them was some people find that with disability, they just can't get through the day, and stuff like that. And it's like, well, very broad. That doesn't actually tell a panel of doctors your experience, for example, of depression. And initial hoops just to get ODSB, I was turned down the first time. And then so my family doctor had to fill out the forms and copy the notes from the specialist, but the specialist actually had to fill it out for me. And it's really invalidating because the system's here to support people who really would prefer to work. I really would. But parenting and juggling pain and juggling now my child's special needs, I hate that. I hate that this is part of the juggle, but it's my reality. So, as the study wrapped up, we all descended into chaos of COVID-19. And our last Photovoice session took place in June of 2020 when we were still at home and still thinking this might end soon. But it allowed all of us to talk very carefully about what COVID-19 had revealed about the social benefits program, about how easy it is to roll out benefits when everyone needs them and they're not considered special. And it allowed for a more intense reflection on our work as mothers and workers and how differently each of us was considered during a pandemic. As the study concluded, we all struggled very significantly with the pandemic. It was particularly difficult for the women in the study who were living at the margins of benefits and child support. They noted that while they were expected to do more child work, because the children were all home and needed to be homeschooled, their ODSP did not increase. It wasn't acknowledging that extra work they were doing, or extra housework, that their food bills grew, but there were no supports for those who were already using ODSP. And there was no supports for those who hadn't been employed for some time before the pandemic. Indeed, we had decided as a country that Canadians were worth $2,000 a month, but those with disabilities on provincial supports weren't getting anywhere near that amount. So it never increased, but the photos kept coming, but they were different now because they were mostly at home. And in this photo taken by Alex was part of a series of photos of unfinished projects that she shared with the group. Unfinished projects, flowers, and a quippy hat she took for the project. She explains that this beautiful photo this way. She says, I got a master's degree and all this crazy academic stuff, to get a real career, but then the world fell apart and here I am in the 1950s. So now I just grow things, which is true of this garden, which has been my solace in this time. It's when I like to think about what I want to do in the world though. I look at this mess and piles all over my house and I know that this is a direct result of the brain I've got. And eventually, somehow, it just gets beautiful. When I look at these pictures, it's part of the process and it's who you are, but it's not all of who you are. I do all this, I like some of it, and I don't like some of it, but this is the package you get with all of this. Another really haunting, beautiful photo that was taken very early in the study, but just shared at the end of it on a very hot summer day when we could all really appreciate the snow and the cold. So Charlotte shared this photo and why she took it so early in the study. She said, I remember our first meeting, talking about my husband and talking about my struggles. The day after our first meeting, I separated from him, and a few days later, my friend took me here and I took this picture. And I don't know, I remember leaning against a tree and taking a deep breath. Very dramatic. Charlotte left a difficult marriage midway through the project and before quarantine. And she was brave enough to share part of those experiences with us and the difficulty of navigating so many systems, trying to get out of a difficult space. The women in the study also reflected on how hard it was to be closed off from the world and deprioritized over and over again. Alex said, I think the lack of physical space is very much related to the lack of representational space, especially with the COVID recovery plan. Where are mothers again? Have we been considered at all? We're just these invisible forces there to take care of everything. But we don't actually need anything like money or time or careers or, social support and all the things that have been there for this point, even for the kids to do with parents and mothers primarily. Pools, beaches, spaces where you can go to be together as a family. Those have not been prioritized. And Charlotte said in response, when I look at these pictures in Toronto of these packed beaches, there are a lot of people living in small apartments with no air conditioning. It's not as simple as they're being selfish. This is really hard. So as we moved into COVID-19, I started to get uncomfortable with the soft language of women leaving the workplace. Women are leaving the way you would leave a party or leave your house, right? But women are actually being forced out of their jobs or forced to make very difficult decisions. The language of leaving doesn't do justice to the long-term impact this will have for many. And those in stable employment are losing pensions and stable income, nor the limited choices so many people have. The numbers show us that women are leaving, and that's important quantitative data, but the deeper qualitative research is needed to understand the emotion, the impacts, the stressors, the social change needed to facilitate support for those who have left. So as we wrapped up together, I asked the women individually and as a group to think about what would fix all this? And I said, without a price tag, pie in the sky, think big, think small, anything at all. So they were asked to reflect on the kinds of changes that are required to support them as mothers, workers, and engaged citizens in the communities. And these were a few of their suggestions for real change right now. First, universal basic income, because Canada decided to do it during COVID-19 and could roll it out rapidly when it wasn't considered special. And I thought that was a very important way of addressing that inequity being addressed, understanding that when it is needed for everyone and it's essential and it's not considered special, then we can roll it out quickly. It also acknowledges the work that these mothers do. And my understanding of work has changed throughout the study to not just be paid work and paid employment, to the work of going to the grocery store when you are likely going to be confronted, harassed, discriminated against, what obstacles face you, that a universal basic income would actually assist women in having some autonomy and choice over leaving difficult relationships, and being acknowledged for the work that they do. Free and well-supported legal assistance, so justice doesn't cost $300 an hour, as one of the participants said in the study. It's fine to have all the rights in the world, but unless you can actually, bring cases forward, unless you can actually challenge them, this is not working. And I think that was a really important part of the discussion, is a lot of people need help with a lot of the bureaucracies. We've built these really difficult environments, and now we expect people to navigate them wholly independently. There was also a talk of just building accessible spaces, right? Parks, time, places for mothers and children with disabilities, libraries, free, safe spaces where people can go with their children and feel like they are part of a community. Lots of little things, these are just a few of them, and final one is that employers need to understand human rights. And I'm going to speak a little bit to that because I think this is a really big part of the conclusion of this project. But too much of the solution is based on whether somebody has goodwill in your workplace, whether you've got a nice manager, whether that guy gets it or this woman gets it. We need large institutions to understand what their responsibilities are. We need people to use the language of human rights in the workplace so that accessibility isn't considered a nice thing to do. Throughout my project, I was actually the accessibility specialist for the City of London, and I still am. The photos that were shared with me and the stories shared with me throughout the project were exceptionally important to my own practice. And they were hard, right? How do you look at an inaccessible park when technically you're responsible for making it inaccessible? And how do I fix it? And how do I navigate these difficult spaces? And how do I take this information and put it directly into practice? And I'm still working on that. It's not an easy flick a switch solution. I carry the images of the women in this study with me all the time. And I think about them all the time. And it has helped me think broadly about the way we build policy to impact only the individual, but not their family, as if they're sort of untangled from this network of caring and support systems and people that need them. We have untangled people from their homes, their lives, their children, the relationships they have, and their communities. We've made it so people just arrive at work. They don't navigate a system of inaccessibility to get there. They don't navigate a system that is broken, that is paratransit, right? Or that isn't working, that's conventional transit. We decide that when somebody arrives at the workplace, that is when we can accommodate, but we don't look broadly at the social structures which affect them all the time. Photo research methods, while not accessible to everyone, are an important way to collect data about city and provincial inaccessibility. And so I'm trying to figure out ways which, when we're researching on behalf of the city, or if we're working with a nonprofit, how can we use photos to leverage some of these stories and experiences and build this collective? Because it's really amazing when you watch it come together. Stories and storytelling, regardless of whether it's affiliated with images, are so important as a part of research. And so we wanted not just stick with surveys, but actually ask people, send me a picture of what that is. When I talk to people on the phone, I usually have them sort of describe vividly for me what exactly is the obstacle, rather than, there's a curb cut. It was like, okay, tell me what the problem is, and I'll go out and look, because I do find that really understanding somebody's point of view helps. Research takes time, but so does social change. And I think we need this really engaged research to make that social change. We need continued collaboration between academic research and community organizations and governments, and not in a knowledge mobilization role, right? So not, I will study over here in academia and I will give you the information, but truly bringing experts together for collaborative research opportunities. That is where I think we're going to find more change. And while online research and interviews has increased opportunities for some, it has come with barriers for others. So increasing attention to storytelling and in-person storytelling opportunities should be investigated, no matter where you work, nonprofit, academia, what have you. So I'm just going to briefly start to wrap up before I move into the Q&A, but I want to talk a little bit about why I don't like the word barrier for what women are facing, in particular women of the study. Barrier implies a singular, movable, changeable, or at least identifiable object that can be moved, but barrier isn't always physical. How do you move attitudes? We must acknowledge that we have built really inaccessible spaces, and then we whine about how much it's going to cost to fix. But I think we need to start acknowledging all of our roles and being complicit in allowing these structures to continue to be made inaccessibly, and then our own unwillingness or reticence to make that change. It makes the solutions easier to spot when you can actually ask, who is this built for? Who is this for? Who's this program designed for? Because then you can understand your own limitations. One obstacle is a barrier, but a cascade of ableism, right, is structural violence. And mothers with disabilities are punished most significantly by that violence every day, because it's that intersection of judgment and the layered oppressions. And it's time to reimagine work and belonging and ableism in our communities. And as June says, who wants to live without hope? So I am really working. I had a great community advocate very recently, the past few months, say we have to use stronger language. And I absolutely agree. So I'm embracing that. We must name ableism. We talk a lot in soft language around accessibility. It's, it's inaccessible. It's accessibility. We should move there, but really name it and name the impact of ableism. We must all acknowledge the ways in which we're complicit, and in order that we recognize how commonplace and plain it has become. So using the language of discrimination and injustice helps. We need to listen to the very, very active voices in your community. Lots of people working really, really hard on this work. We just need to listen. If you haven't been listening, it's time. And locate yourself, your business, your workplace, and your role as part of the problem, because when you do, you better locate your role in the solution. Make your space accessible. Think through as many options as possible for every program, service, webinar, poster, anything you engage with that you're going to make. And ask questions so that the work of survival is not so significant. And remember Kimberly Rogers. I'll wrap up by saying one of my favorite sayings is accessibility is not a nice thing to do. We have for too long believed that accessibility is really the work of really good people. And I found myself facing that because I have a master's degree in women's studies. And when you say you have a master's degree in women's studies, people generally want to argue with you wherever you are about how that's not fair. But when you tell them you have a master's in critical disability studies, they tell you must be a really nice person. Right. And that shows that ableist attitude that accessibility is just considered something nice if we've got the budget, that type of thing. The fact is, it's essential. It's a human right, and it needs to start now. I'm going to end with a funny quote from one of the women in the study. She said, "We're all in this together, blah, 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 blah. They were all on the Titanic together too, and look how that worked out." So just a nice way of looking at how the classes all manage things differently, and her understanding of how we're actually not all in this together. And just because we are all in this together, it may not work out so well if we're not careful about rebuilding. I think we're right on time to start to do some Q&A. So if people are interested in asking a question, you can type it into the Q&A section. And I see we have a couple of people right here. Great questions. Thank you so much. So the first question is, I am curious if any participants identified as being a substance user, and if that nuance of the stigma on mothering and being a substance user was explored. Yes, they did. And they did identify that a little bit. How I looked at that and how we analyzed that was through the lens of sort of that mothers don't stigma, right? Mothers don't need to do that. They're endlessly happy because we have all these things to do. And we really looked at how motherhood, ableism, and addiction um, were particularly difficult for that particular person in the study. And I believe there were two women in the study who had experiences with that. It wasn't a big part of the study, but it was examined. Um, Thank you very much for your question, Marjorie. It says, these voices are powerful. They illustrate what is. I just wonder, is there a strategy and thought about disseminating these results to media, politicians, lobbyists, employers? I mean, part of Photovoice is actually you are required, like the Photovoice process requires that you share, which is what I really like about it. So I've developed a website. I'm not quite done launching it yet. I'm going to be doing a few podcasts with some local folks about their experiences as mothers with disabilities who are not involved in the study, but I'm presenting sort of the discussion with them, and we're just going to have a discussion about the knowledge that was generated. And so that's one way that we do it. It's a complicated question because I'm also sort of political, so it will manifest itself in different ways. I'm hoping that the website will generate some interest, but it's also now just the way that I do work, right? So I will share the findings with anyone. If you're on the bus with me ever, that's how it works. And so I'm just always trying to share this, but yeah, I don't know outside of that what I would do. How do you feel about university programs not being accessible for people with disabilities? For instance, asking folks to spend more money to take longer to complete their degree. Yeah, I mean, I don't feel good about that, Gabrielle. I feel this very heavily. I think there's a significant amount of academic ableism, and we still have built structures and schools for very particular bodies, and the women in the study would have absolutely indicated that as well. And they had very significant discussions around being blamed when they got frustrated by the process, and being told, it's in your attitude. So I don't feel good about it, but more importantly, the women in the study didn't feel good about it, and it is a significant barrier. And again, like the workplace, the university, we operate like they arrive there, and that's the only place that is difficult, right? But we don't talk about transit, we don't talk about caregiving, we don't talk about the fact that some people have to work quite significantly outside of school. All of those things can make it for an inaccessible experience. Do you have any recommendations for readings, trainings that could help support making spaces, structures, and programs more accessible? I can actually make a list for you. So if you want to email me, I have my email on the last slide, and I would put together a little list. I think there's a lot of us that are doing a lot of work in this area in terms of employer spaces and making people aware of the ways that they participate in ableism. And so I'd love to put together just a little worksheet for you and just some resources. So my email, I'm going to flip it over to the last slide. If anyone wants to be in touch, I'm just giving out my email here. I am always happy to hear from researchers who are doing also work in this area. I'm always thrilled to meet other people who are working in this area. And I'm also really excited about other accessibility specialists. I often tell people this job is very lonely, so it's nice when people want to reach out and connect. Is there somewhere we can access the study? Yes, if you want to email me at that email address, I will send you the link to the website once it's up, and it will give you all of that information. Another Melanie. It seems like many of the participants are people with physical disabilities. Did you explore the unique perspectives of people with intellectual disabilities? Great question, Melanie. Nope, the study was particularly targeted to mothers with physical disabilities. I felt I needed to find some focus because it's such a huge study. So that was the focus of the study, though some women had intersecting disabilities that certainly wouldn't disqualify them, but that was not the focus of this study. Great question from Jeff. Was there anything the women spoke about that made their child welfare involvement any less negative? Anything workers can do to create better engagement with mothers with disabilities? So over the course of my many years involved with casework and accessibility advocacy and also this project, one of the biggest things missing is positive views of mothers with disabilities as people who are creative and engaged and whole people. I think a lot of the feedback from the different women was about feeling very much like the whole focus of that child welfare professional was actually on their body and what it couldn't do. Where people felt like they had a decent interaction was mostly with social workers around prenatal visits and things like that. Actually said, do you know where to find an accessible crib? Oh, I've got, have you connected with this organization? Because they actually can help you retrofit a crib or build an accessible change table, or have like people that were knowledgeable about what the community could provide, rather than saying, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do? And one of the women in the study talked a lot about her entire postpartum experience at the hospital, peppered with, how are you going to handle it? How are you going to change a diaper? How are you, instead of, okay, let's work together to figure out how to make this easier, right? What are you thinking? How would you change a diaper? Women have thought about this, right? They've got a lot of plans. And so I think that the most important part of their engagement with child welfare organizations was just a respect for the fact that they've thought this through, and that they have interest in the child welfare, and that they might just need help finding resources, but not about addressing sort of personal brokenness, if that makes sense. What prompted your decision to use Photovoice as a tool for the research? I was really looking for a project that I felt would bring women together to talk, and my supervisor had introduced me to Photovoice, and she's fantastic. So I took a course in England. I got to go, I'm a single parent, so I got to go away for like 6 whole days on my own and learn and actually take this course. And by the end of it, I was sold. They had very different experiences with Photovoice than I would, but the goal was to take a Photovoice project and to make it an accessible Photovoice. So that was what drew me to it. Oh, thank you so much, Pam. Can you send us the references to some of your publications? I can. What I will do is put together a little list of things that I've used, publications that I've cited, some of the information, and then also the link to the new website, and I will prepare that. And anyone who emails me, I'll email it out. Can you speak more to how the women who experienced domestic violence faced ableism? Yeah, that was a huge one. It was actually the subject of almost an entire Photovoice experience. And one of the things that stuck out to me, and it haunts me, was the way that one of the lawyers told a woman that he couldn't hurt her there. He can't hurt you here. And her response, and I remember like, oh, chills, was, we're talking about my children. This is where he can hurt me most. And there was a lot of hide your disability, right? A lot of the way disability is used to showcase whether or not a woman is competent. So how are we going to give her custody if she can't even get to a community park, right? She can't even keep a job. So how are we? It was just filled with this ableism. It was filled with discrimination and disregard for women's unique experiences. And it absolutely favored the able-bodied parent, the enabled parent. So I could spend a whole webinar talking about that, but it was a big part of the research, and I'm happy to send you some of that. There's lots of questions. So I'm just like, we're kind of wrapping up, but I want to answer all these questions. So if I don't get to your question, please email me and I'm happy to email you back. As a child and youth care practitioner student, I'm wondering how we can help parents with disabilities overcome inequality and accessibility issues. I think that's a great question, Trista. I think one of the biggest challenges is, again, locating the problem outside of the individual, right? So how are you going to do this isn't going to solve the problem. It's like, how are we going to work together to find a childcare that is accessible so that you can come in and pick your child up? Or how are we going to work with paratransit? Or like it has to be a much broader question than looking at the individual and blaming them for their own challenges, because we know society is broken, right? We know that. So while women might have individual fixes and changes that they want to use, I think our best bet for actually making structural change is to really start to do that work. Keep a list of accessible daycares, keep a list of accessible playgrounds. When you host any event, and I think one of the most frustrating things I felt was one of the women brought her little one to one of our Photovoice sessions, which was, we love kids, we're well, child friendly. But she said this is the first time he's sort of been in a group because all of the children's groups were in inaccessible spaces or in people's houses that were inaccessible. So when you're going to put on programs, who are they for? Is there captioning? Is there, do we have interpreters? Did we think, about as many people as possible? I think that's one of the big things we can do. Dr. Cruzen, I see you're here. That's great. Did your participants discuss medical trauma? Yes. And I'm happy to share some of that with you offline. But yes, one in particular was really, really horrendous. So I would absolutely, I would love to connect with you. So question is, applying for disability parking card is not free and getting it adds stress. Absolutely. Can we advocate for women with disability to get it free without fees? I'm all for advocacy. So I would absolutely push for that, but also recognize we can also do other things like help with those payments. We can help with the process. We can help with the application. We can help, we can also help to take our ableism out of that situation too, and not police spaces ourselves. So I think we're kind of, okay, I'm going to take probably 2 more quick questions. I see, this is always happy because I see many friendly and faces that I know. Hi, Leslie, I see you here. And your question was, how did you define disability in your work? Who was included? So it's a very broad definition for my work, but for this particular group, I actually focused on mothers with physical disability. So that was it. I said self-identify, because I wasn't as interested in the medical label as I was in women's experiences, right? So that's how I did. It was very, very broad. So I didn't particularly label disability, but I said when I was putting out my requests for participants was, do you identify as a mother with a physical disability or a mother with a disability? And what we found was that women had a variety of disabilities. So oftentimes their disability was at the intersection of mental health and physical. But that was what I needed to narrow the study, and I needed to understand some commonality. So that's why I choose that. All right. And just one comment, so to sort of wrap it up, sadly from our work, we have found that CAS and many other health and social services providers do not receive any disability related training, and that absolutely emerged in the work. And absolutely, it's one of the most significant things that I think could be addressed very early on is to require that as a competency, to be aware of how people engage, communicate, what kind of supports are available for mothers with disabilities. I mean, we could start there. So I think that's probably a good way to wrap up the hour. But I really hope that that everyone has learned something today, or at least heard from the women of the study, and that you'll carry some of those images with you as we go forward. I am always happy to receive email at my UWO account, and I will try to get back to you as soon as I can. And I will, now that I know that there's a bit of interest, I'll make sure I'll get that website up as soon as possible, and make sure that I share the link with anyone who emails. So I'd just like to thank you so much for having me today. Thank you to neighbors, family, and friends for giving me this opportunity to talk about my research. I really look forward to connecting with so many of you as we go forward. And I appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.